I still remember the drive up to the cabin. It was supposed to be a weekend away. Just me and Sarah. No distractions, no stress. Nothing but the quiet of nature. We needed this. After months of long workdays and endless city noise, the thought of disconnecting from everything sounded perfect. So when we found the listing for a cabin on the very edge of a forest, the edge of the world, the locals called it, we were sold. The place was miles from any town, tucked so far into the woods that we lost phone signal an hour before we even reached it. The road got narrower, more rugged, like it was warning us we were leaving civilization behind. But that's what we wanted, peace. We wanted to be somewhere no one could reach us. When we pulled up, the cabin looked just like the photos. Rustic, isolated, with thick trees surrounding it like silent sentinels. The air was fresh, almost unnaturally so, and there was the stillness to the place that felt calming at first. No traffic, no city hum, just the wind rustling the leaves. I could see why they called it the edge of the world. It really felt like we were standing at the boundary between two different realities. Sarah smiled as she stepped out of the car, taking it all in. "This is going to be perfect," she said, her voice almost swallowed by the quiet. I nodded, feeling the same excitement she did. We were alone, finally away from everything. Little did we know how that isolation would soon feel like a curse rather than a blessing. But right then it was just us, the cabin, and the endless forest. And I had no idea that something or someone was watching us from the trees. The first night started off like any other, calm, quiet. We unpacked, made some dinner, and sat on the small porch with a bottle of wine, listening to the night settle in around us. It was peaceful at first, the kind of quiet that you can't find in the city, where everything feels so still you can almost hear your own thoughts. But as the sun sank below the treeline, something shifted. It wasn't just the darkness, it was the silence, a kind of silence that felt wrong. I remember noticing it all at once. No birds, no insects, nothing but this heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to press down on us from all sides. I mentioned it to Sarah, trying to make a joke about how creepy it was, but she didn't laugh. "I don't like it," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the forest beyond the cabin. "It feels off." I brushed it off. "It's just nature. We're not used to being out here like this. Too much city noise makes silence feel weird." But deep down, I couldn't shake the strange feeling settling in the pit of my stomach. Later that night, as we lay in bed, the noises started. At first, they were faint, just distant rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I figured it was an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon. But then it got louder, like footsteps crunching through the dry leaves. I sat up, listening. It wasn't constant, but every now and then, I'd hear it, closer, then further away, as if something was circling the cabin. Sarah noticed it too. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "That's not an animal." I tried to stay calm, tried to rationalize it. "It's probably just the wind messing with the trees. There's nothing out there." But then she said something that made my skin crawl. "I saw something," she murmured, "out by the treeline. Something moving." I glanced out the window, my eyes straining to see through the blackness. The moon barely lit up the forest, and all I could make out were the jagged shapes of the trees. Nothing moved. "Come on, Sarah," I said, trying to sound confident, even though my heart was pounding. "It's dark. Your eyes are playing tricks on you." She didn't argue, but I could see the fear in her eyes. We both lay back down, but the tension in the room was thick, impossible to ignore. Every rustle, every distant sound, made Sarah flinch, and I could feel the unease creeping into me too. I kept telling myself it was just paranoia, just the unfamiliar surroundings messing with our heads. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Something was out there, watching us, and somehow, I had the sickening feeling that it was getting closer. The next morning, Sarah was still on edge. She barely slept, and I could tell by the way she kept glancing out the window that she hadn't let go of what happened the night before. I tried to lighten the mood, suggesting we go for a hike or explore the area, but she wasn't having it. She said she needed to stay inside, so I went along with it, even though the cabin was starting to feel more like a cage than a getaway. That's when she found the journal. I was in the kitchen, making coffee, when I heard her call my name. Her voice was quiet, almost like she didn't want to be heard. I walked over to find her sitting on the floor by the dresser, holding this old, leather-bound notebook in her hands. The cover was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. "Where did you find that?" I asked, crouching down beside her. "In the drawer," she said, her eyes wide. "It was just there." At first, I thought it was just some old guest book, maybe something left behind by the cabin's previous renters. But as Sarah started flipping through the pages, we realized it was something else entirely. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic, like the person who wrote it was barely holding it together. The first few entries seemed normal, descriptions of the cabin, the surrounding woods, the same excitement we had felt when we first arrived. But then, it started to shift. The writer talked about hearing strange noises at night, whispers in the dark, footsteps outside the cabin. They mentioned seeing figures at the treeline, just out of reach, always watching but never getting close. Sarah's face paled as she read out loud, her voice trembling. It was like reading a reflection of our own experience. The deeper we got into the journal, the more unsettling it became. The writer described the same growing sense of dread that we had felt, like the air was thick with something unseen, something wrong. They mentioned dreams that felt too real, dreams of someone standing at the foot of their bed, watching them sleep. The same figure they saw in the woods. The worst part was the last few entries. They became disjointed, erratic, like the writer was losing their grip on reality. Their descriptions grew more frantic, about hearing voices calling their name, about seeing something lurking just outside the windows. They kept writing about the feeling of being stalked, followed, but no matter how hard they looked, they couldn't find anything. The final entry was short, scrawled hastily across the page. "It's in the house. I can hear it. This is my last night. If anyone finds this, run." That was it. No name, no date. Nothing to say who the writer was or what had happened to them. Just silence after that. I stared at the journal in disbelief, my stomach churning. Sarah was shaking now, her eyes wide and unblinking. She didn't say anything, but I could see the terror etched into her face, the realization that whatever had happened to this person, it was happening to us. We sat there in the stillness, the weight of the journal pressing down on us like a dark cloud. I wanted to say something, anything to calm her down, but I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. Because if what the journal said was true, we weren't alone. We were being watched, and it wasn't going to stop. That night was different. Everything felt heavier, darker. After finding that journal, the tension between Sarah and me was unbearable. She was barely holding it together, and I wasn't much better. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both knew, whatever was out there, it wasn't done with us. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, the cabin seemed to close in on us. The shadows stretched longer, deeper, and no matter how many lights we turned on, it felt like the darkness was crawling through every crack and corner. Sarah sat by the window, staring out at the treeline, her face pale and drawn. I tried to distract myself, pretending like everything was fine, but inside, I could feel the fear tightening around my chest. Then the noises started again. At first, it was the same rustling in the woods, but this time it wasn't distant. It was close, too close. Something was moving just beyond the cabin, circling us, pacing like a predator stalking its prey. Every so often, I'd catch a faint thud, like footsteps crunching in the leaves, but they were heavier than any animal I'd ever heard. Sarah stood up, her eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, my mouth dry. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. Every sound, every shadow, felt like it was creeping closer. I kept telling myself it was just paranoia, that we were working ourselves up over nothing. But deep down, I knew better. We weren't imagining this. And then the rattling began. The front door shook violently, as if someone, or something was trying to break it down. Sarah screamed, grabbing my arm. I rushed to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The doorknob twisted back and forth, as though someone was on the other side, desperately trying to get in. "Who's there?" I shouted, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. There was no response, just the relentless shaking, the windows vibrating in their frames. I locked the door and backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "We need to leave," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to get out of here. Now." I nodded, grabbing the car keys and heading for the door. But the moment we stepped outside, the air felt thick, almost suffocating. The wind had picked up, and the forest around us seemed to move, the trees swaying unnaturally in the darkness. We sprinted to the car, the gravel crunching under our feet, but the second I tried to start the engine, I knew we were in trouble. The car wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died, as if something had drained the life out of it. I tried again. Nothing. Sarah was panicking now, frantically checking her phone, but of course, there was no signal. There hadn't been any since we arrived. "We're trapped," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We can't leave." I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. Every rational part of me wanted to believe this was just some horrible coincidence. A dead battery, bad luck. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Something didn't want us to leave. Something was keeping us here. The rattling at the cabin started again, louder this time. The windows, the door, they were all shaking, like the entire place was coming apart. I could see shadows darting between the trees, closer now, flickering at the edges of the headlights. Sarah grabbed my arm, tears in her eyes. "Eric, we can't stay here. We need to go." I nodded, but my mind was blank. I had no plan, no escape. The only thing I knew for certain was that whatever was out there wasn't going to let us go easily. The forest, the cabin, it all felt like a trap, and we had walked right into it. The noises were everywhere now. Scratching, thudding, whispering, growing louder by the second. Something was toying with us, testing our limits, waiting for us to break. I looked at Sarah, my heart pounding, and in that moment, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about scaring us. It was about wearing us down. We couldn't stay in the car. The walls of the cabin shook so violently I thought they'd collapse, and the shadows outside were growing bolder, moving closer, no longer content to stay at the edges of the light. Whatever was out there, it was toying with us, pushing us to the brink. We had no choice. We had to run. "Let's go," I said, grabbing Sarah's hand. She nodded, her face pale and tear-streaked, her eyes wide with terror. We bolted from the car, heading for the trees, hoping the forest would offer some kind of cover, some way out of this nightmare. As soon as we hit the tree line, it felt like we were plunging into another world. The air was cold, unnaturally cold, and the trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like twisted, gnarled fingers. The ground was uneven, the roots tangling beneath our feet, making it hard to run. But we didn't stop. We couldn't. Behind us, I could still hear the cabin rattling, the wind howling, and that awful whispering, closer now, almost in our ears. My heart pounded in my chest, every breath a struggle as we pushed deeper into the woods, blindly running through the darkness, hoping, praying, for a way out. But then we stumbled into the clearing. I stopped dead in my tracks, pulling Sarah with me. The trees opened up into a small, moonlit space, and what we saw there made my stomach turn. Scattered across the ground were the remains of what had once been campsites. Torn tents, rusted camping gear, and personal belongings left behind like a graveyard of forgotten lives. Shoes, backpacks, shattered lanterns, all strewn haphazardly in the dirt. But that wasn't the worst part. It was the bones. Human bones, half buried in the ground, twisted and broken. Some were fresh, others bleached white by the elements, scattered among the debris like discarded toys. Skulls stared back at us from the shadows, empty eye sockets watching in silent judgment. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt Sarah's grip tighten on my hand. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. This is where they all went." Suddenly, it all made sense. The journal, the sounds, the feeling of being watched. The cabin wasn't just isolated, it was a trap, a lure for people like us, and we had walked right into it just like the others. We weren't the first to come here, and we wouldn't be the last. "We need to go," I muttered, my voice shaking, but my legs felt like they were made of lead, rooted to the ground as the horrifying reality sank in. There was no escape. Not for us. Not for anyone. Sarah let out a choked sob, her body trembling. "We're going to die here," she said, her voice cracking with despair. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that we would find a way out, that we could still make it. But deep down, I knew the truth. The forest, the cabin, they were all part of the same twisted game. We had been led here just like the others, and now we were nothing more than prey. I don't know how long we stood there, frozen in that clearing, surrounded by the remnants of those who had come before us. Time seemed to stretch, the world narrowing to the sound of our shallow breaths and the distant whisper of the wind through the trees. And then, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. I looked at Sarah, and in her eyes, I saw the same realization I felt deep in my bones. Whatever had been toying with us was done playing. The hunt was over. We weren't going to escape. In those final moments, I'm not sure what happened. Did we run? Did we try to fight? Or did we simply stand there, waiting for whatever it was to claim us like it had the others? All I know is that the darkness closed in, the clearing faded from view, and everything became still. I'd like to believe we made it out, that somehow, by some miracle, we escaped the fate of those before us. But I can't say for sure, because in this place, at the edge of the world, the line between life and death is razor thin. And sometimes, when you cross it, there's no way back.